All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. A lot to do today. Beautiful daf out of us today. Today's daf is Chaf Dalid 24. We are going to pick up on Chaf Gimel Amud Beis 23b, and we are going to pick up. Nata Rubo. So we're picking up. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. Last word on the line, Nata. So I want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Ed, and Faith Wolf, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this week in memory of our beloved father, grandfather, great-grandfather, Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch, Zichron Livracha, to thank our week of learning sponsor, Joe and Galia Barry, in honor of their 43rd wedding anniversary and successful Aliyah 3.5 years ago. Sham Shav and Aliyah and the family in the Chama, and Mazel Tov to the berries. Emir Hashem Admeh Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. And about with that, let us begin. So remember again, the topic of our conversation, which is really quite fascinating, are the halachos of a karfeif. So very simply put, the karfeif is any large area enclosed for non-residential purposes. So therefore, again, what we're beginning to see is that whenever you enclose a non-residential area, there's always going to be a cap or limitations as to the size of the area that you could enclose. Not only that, but we saw in the last Mishnah that not only are there size limitations, but it's also quite possible that halacha l'maisa, there have to be certain domicile-like qualities inside of that area in order to be able to properly use it. So again, that was our machlokes. That was our machlokes in the Mishnah yesterday. So we're continuing a little bit along that theme. So says the Gemara, Nata Rubo. So we'll say, listen to the following situation. Nata Rubo means what happens if you planted the majority of the karfeif. Then I will say, now in this circumstance, what happened is as follows. You planted in a way that pretty much, well, you planted. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, actually, not yet, sorry. So Nata Rubo, if you went ahead and you planted the majority of, did I skip? Karfeif, sorry. Karfeif shu yosem beis hasayim, thank you. Just one line up, right by the little dalit. Karfeif shu yosem beis hasayim, thank you. Shukaf ladira. So we'll say, if you went ahead, thank you. If you enclose the karfeif that is more than 2 beis sa'ah. Now we'll say, now listen to this. So in this case over here, it's more than 2 beis sa'ah, which is normally a problematic amount. The saving grace over here is shehukaf ladira. It was enclosed for residential purposes. So it was enclosed for residential purposes. What's the halacha? Nizra rubo harehu kigina va'aser. If you went ahead and you planted the majority of it, it is like a gina. Now we'll say a gina is a garden. A garden is not an area used for activities of daily living, and therefore it's aser. So we'll say in this case, just so you understand, what you have over here happening is as follows. I have a karfeif that's more than 2 beis sa'ah, okay, but it's enclosed for domicile, for residential purposes. So far, so good. Except now the problem is I plant in it. I just plant stuff in it. Well, once I plant stuff in it, it loses its identity as a residential area. And once it loses its identity as a residential area, then what happens? It is an enclosed non-residential area larger than 2 beis sa'ah. Well, once that happens, carrying becomes prohibited throughout the entire area. However, not a rubo. We'll say, what happens if I planted trees? Now, in the first case of nizra, means I planted plants or grain, whatever it might be. In case number 2, I planted trees. Hareyu kechatzer umuter. Ultimately, again, it's like a chatzar. If you plant the trees, it's like a chatzar, and therefore, again, it is still considered to be a residential area which is enclosed, or an area which is enclosed for residential purposes. Now, what's the chilik between trees and other things? If you look at Rashi says nizra rubo. Rashi says bizer onim batal dira. So the bizer onim lo dari inshi vahavi legina va'asla taltal af b'shein on nizra the batal legabe ruba aval benotea ilanos lo batal dira. So the archol listofeif betzel ilanos tamid. I will say here's the distinction: when you plant plants, grain, vegetables, by definition, people don't walk around and utilize an area in which vegetation or grain is planted. So therefore, by definition, when you plant vegetation or grain, you have been mevatel, you have negated the identity of this area as a domicile area. Whereas when you plant trees, so people will often walk around and utilize treed areas. I don't know if that's a proper word, which I understand. Area with trees, right? So therefore, halacha l'maaseh, even if you planted trees, it does not lose its identity as a residential area. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna, Rav Yoshua, Lo Amar El Yosmi Beis Sasayim. This is only said when it's an area that's greater than 2 Beis Aval Beis Sasayim mutter. But halacha l'maaseh, if it's 2 Beis, it appears even if you went ahead and you planted other items in it, it would still be mutter. So the Gemara says, Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Shimon, this is not Rabbi Shimon Omer, Echad gagos ve'echad chatzeros ve'echad karfifos, Rishus achas hin lekilin sheshav subesochen. Because Rabbi Shimon says that rooftops, chatzeros, karfifos are considered to all be one large rishus for any utensils which began Shabbos in that area. Sheshav subesochen velo sheshav subesoch habayis. But that's only to utensils which are inside any one of these areas, but not utensils inside of a home. Rabbi Shimon nami kevan denizra rubo. So the Gemara wants to suggest that the fact that according to Rabbi Shimon, all of these areas are considered to be like one area. So even if it was planted, it would still be okay. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon nami kevan denizra rubo habe hahu miuta. Top of Chavdalit. But we'll say even according to Rabbi Shimon, if you planted the majority of this area, so lemais again the miut, right, the smaller unplanted area is going to be bottled to the rove. And it'll be considered to be a karfef that is larger than 2 beis, and ultimately it will be aser. Rather, if you're going to go ahead and frame the halachas, you have to frame it. Hamiuta shari. That I will say, if halacha l'maisa, some piece of this karfef was not planted, that miut would be permitted. Rav Yoshua, aman eladolo havi beis sasayim. That's only true if it was not 2 beis. Aval beis sasayim aser, but if it's the size of 2 beis, it'll be aser. Kiman, who is that? Who is that like? Kirabanan. Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti masni lekula. Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti. His version of this was lekula. Hamiuta shari. We'll say if you have a part of the 2 beis which was not planted, it would retain its permitted status. That's only true if it was exactly 2 beis or less. But if it was more than 2 beis, then ultimately again it would be aser. Kiman k'Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, so therefore the last version of this has it as follows: that as much as halacha l'maaseh, if you have an area which was enclosed, let's say you have a karfef that was 2 beis, which was enclosed for residential purposes. So far so good. Less than 2 beis enclosed for residential purposes, you're definitely good to go. Then what happens? You go ahead and you plant the majority of it. So it appears based on the last version of this, the planted area will become aser because it is now a non-residential area because you can't use a planted area. But the miut, the small unplanted area, still remains permitted for use. Good. Says the Gemara, not a ruba harika chatzru mutter. So let's remember again. The Gemara now is quoting the Brisa. So if you remember again, the Brisa we just quoted on Chaf Gimel Amud Beis made a distinction between planting a karfef with, let's say we'll call it vegetation and grain, what we call seeds, versus planting a karfef with trees. So remember that fundamental distinction. The Gemara understood trees don't negate the residential identity, which the logic behind it is because people walk around amongst trees, you could use the area amongst trees, therefore it could still be used in a domicile capacity. Masha'enkin, when you plant seeds, whether it's vegetation, grain, you can no longer use that area in a domicile capacity. So nizra rubo harei kechatzer mutter. So we'll say, listen to this. So now, if you have a karfef that's 2 beis or even technically more, and you went ahead and you enclosed it for residential purposes, and then you planted trees throughout that karfef, the karfef still retains its residential identity, the enclosure still works, and you are permitted to go ahead and carry throughout the karfef. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Avimi, v'hu sha'osuyin itztablos. We'll say that's only assuming that the trees were planted in nice rows. Rashi says itztablos netuin shuros v'no'al l'shevasham. So we'll say this is assuming that essentially what Avimi is saying is the trees were planted in an orderly fashion. So if the trees were planted in an orderly fashion, then what? Then you could utilize the areas in between the trees. Rav Nachman says no. Afa she'ein asuin itztablos. Rav Nachman says no. Even if the trees were not planted in an orderly fashion, it's still fine. I was supposed to say, because even if trees are not planted in orderly fashion, trees generally are not planted on top of each other. So Lamaisa, there's always going to be usable space in between the trees. Is it nice if they're planted in a usable fashion? Sure. But Lamaisa, even if they're planted a bit haphazardly, it still allows you to use the area in a Dama-style fashion. So the Gemara says, Mar Yehuda ikla lebei Rav Huna bar Yehuda. So it says, so what happened? So Mar Yehuda went to the home of Rav Huna bar Yehuda. Chazanhu lahanodolo avidi itztablos. The kamatatli begavayu. He saw that there was a karfeif that was planted with trees. The trees were planted in a very haphazard fashion. They were not planted in orderly fashion, and yet people were still carrying in the karfeif. Now, both say, of course, remember, the karfeif is enclosed. Amar le lo savar lamar lahod da avimi. So he said to him, does Rabbi not hold of the din of avimi, who says that the trees have to be planted in an orderly fashion? Amar le ana kirav Nachman sincerely. So he said, aholik Rav Nachman. Right, Rav Nachman holds that halacha l'maisa, the trees not be planted. The trees don't have to be planted in an orderly fashion. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. So both say, and again, the Rambam Paskin is like Rav Nachman, that halacha l'maisa, if you have a karfeif, even more than 2 beis that is enclosed for residential purposes, if you planted trees there, that does not take away from the domicile identity. And even if the trees are not planted in an orderly fashion, it still retains its domicile identity. Amar Rav Nachman Shmuel. Next case. Karfeif Yosri Beis Asayim, Shelo Hokaf Ladira, Keitzaru Otzes. So also listen to this. So what happens if you have a karfeif that is more than 2 beis that was not enclosed for residential purposes? Now both say, now look what happened over there. Look at Rashi. Karfeif Yosri Beis Asayim Shelo Hokaf Ladira, Va'achari came Bana Etzlo Dira. So here's the case. You have a karfeif. Now the karfeif is enclosed. It is enclosed, but it was not enclosed for residential purposes. Then what happens? You build a home right next to your karfeif. Now both say, we saw already in the Mishnah, this was alluded to, that if you have a home that's next to the karfeif that potentially opens up into the karfeif, so then that can make the karfeif a residential area. But the issue over here is that the original enclosure of that karfeif was not made for domicile purposes. Now, the question that the Gemara is dealing with is, if you have an enclosed karfeif, but the karfeif was not originally enclosed for residential purposes, is there a way to convert the enclosure to make it for residential purposes? To which the Gemara says, yes, Keitzaru Oses, so what should you do? Poritz bo pirtze yosra me'eser, V'godro uma'amido al eser. Let's say very simple eitzah. Breach the karfeif wall more than 10 amas, and then what? And then rebuild it. Because we'll say, what happens when you breach a wall more than 10 amas? Right? 10 amas is that magic number. 10 amas is the size of a breach, which negates the identity of a wall. So essentially, undo the wall. You don't have to knock down the wall in its entirety, but make a hole in the wall 10 amas or more, and then repair it. And when you're both, it's like sukkah, right? The halacha is that you're defanos, right? Your walls have to go ahead and come before your sukkah, right? So what happens if for some reason you put up your schach first, or there was some invalidating factor in your walls, and then the schach was already fixed? So what do? You lift up the schach, you put it down. In other words, sometimes you can remake the identity of something by just simply taking away its identity without totally deconstructing it. So the way to take away the identity of this wall as a wall is make a breach more than 10 amas. Make a breach more than 10 amas, therefore it's no longer a wall, no longer has the din of a mechitza, and then repair it. And now you have a karfeif which is enclosed for residential purposes. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. Say bailahu, piretz or paratz amma v'gadar, paratz amma v'gadra, at sheshlimu liyoser me'eser mahu. So it's an interesting halacha here. So what happens? Now, I don't want to make one large 10 amma breach in my wall. So I have a different answer. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to breach it an amma and repair it. Breach it an amma and repair it. So I'm going to do that 10 consecutive times, or really 11 times. Let's say I'm going to make a breach of 11 ammas. but the wall is never breached. The wall is never breached all 10 amas at once, or all 11. Remember, it has to be breached more than 10 amas, so we'll call it 10 and 11 amas. It never was breached. So you see, hear what I'm doing over here? I'm breaching it one amma at a time, right? I breach, repair, breach, repair, breach, repair. So at the end of the day, I have made a breach of more than 10 amas. Just what? It was never all at once. It was never all at once. So does that work? Amrulay. So he says, love hainu disnan. Did we not already learn? Supposed to we had this case before. Kol klei balibatim shiurin karimonim. We'll say, the halacha is that if a kli, a utensil, becomes tamei, so what's the halacha? It retains its tuma identity until when? Until, I should say, it retains its identity as a kli as long as it could hold something. The moment it can no longer hold something, it's no longer a kli. So for example, by what we call kli balibatim. So stam a kli that belongs to a person. So a person will hold onto a utensil as long as the hole is not big enough that it can retain a pomegranate. But the moment that the hole is so big that a pomegranate could come out of it, it's no longer a kli. So I'll say, so now watch this. So let's reverse this halacha a little bit. I have a kli that became tamei. And let's say, again, I'd like to retire the kli, but let's say it's the type of kli that cannot become tahar, let's say through kashering, or through tefillah and a mikvah. No, not kashering, but tefillah and a mikvah. So I'll say, so what could I do? I could pierce the kli. And as long as I make a hole that's big enough that it can't retain a pomegranate, it's lost its identity as a kli. So I'll say, so now listen to the interesting shaila here. So what happened? Kli balibatim, shirin karimonim, ubay chizkya, nikav kimoti zayis v'sasmo, the chazra v'nikav kimoti zayis v'sasmo, at sheheshlimo lemotzi rimon mahu. So let's listen to the following case. So I have a utensil. I would like to get rid of its tuma status by going ahead and making a hole in it. I know the hole has to be the size of a pomegranate. So what do? I don't pierce it the size of a pomegranate at once. Instead, I pierce it the size of an olive, fill that in. Make another hole in the utensil, size of an olive, fill it in. And I keep on making holes. I make hole, fill in, hole, fill in, hole, fill in, until the shear of all of the holes that I've made, when you add them all together, is what? The size of a pomegranate. The only issue is what? Well, not the only issue. The question is what? Right now, Bosai, the utensil is totally filled in. So Lamaisa, when you look at all the holes that I've made, I have made a hole the size of a pomegranate. The difference is I never made it at once, and every time I made a hole, I filled it back in. What's the halacha? So Va'amli Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shin Salonu, that Rabbi taught us the following. But so now again, remember the case we're trying to ask over here. Just follow the flow. We're talking about now a karfeif, which wasn't more than 2 beis sa'ah, which was enclosed for non-residential purposes. Now I have a residence that opens into it. Wonderful. Now it could be a karfeif enclosed for residential purposes. What's the problem? The problem is, how do I convert that wall into a residential wall? Very simple. What do? Make a gap of more than 10 amas and then fill it back in. Okay, what happens if I don't want to make the gap all at once? Instead, I want to make an amma gap, fill it in, amma gap, fill it in, amma gap, fill it in, until I get to 11, way more than 10. So does that work? Someone says, oh, interesting you bring that up. We had that case before. What's the halacha if you need to make a hole the size of a pomegranate in a utensil? You make the hole of a kizayis, fill it in. Hole of a kizayis, fill it in. Hole of a kizayis, so on and so forth. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi taught us a third case. Sandal shenifsaka achas miaznav v'tikna. Let's say if you have a sandal, a shoe. And in this particular situation, the shoe is tamei. So what happens? So the shoe has 2 straps. One of the straps comes off, v'tikna. And I will say, so you have one strap that came off, one strap that remains. So what's the halacha? Tamei medris. So we'll say, if the shoe was tamei and one of the straps comes off, the shoe still retains its tumah. Why? Because Lamaisa, a shoe even with one strap is still usable. It's still usable, therefore it retains its tumah. However, nifsaka shniya, if the second strap came off, vitikna. So we'll say, so now what happens if the second strap came off and then you fixed it? Tahar min medris, aval tami maga medris. So we'll say, interestingly enough, if the second strap comes off, then what's the halacha? Yeah, actually, I'm sorry. Let me restate that case. Sandal shenifsaka achas miasnav v'tikna. We'll say if you have a sandal, one of the straps came off, and then you fixed it. You put it back. So the sandal still retains its tumah status. Why? Because even in the absence of the second strap, even in the absence of the first strap, the second strap still allows the sandal to remain usable, and as long as it's usable, it retains its tumah status. Okay, now, shnia, now the second strap comes off, right? Vitikna, and then you fix the sandal afterwards. Tar min medris. Both say it is no longer tame tumas medris, aval tame maga medris. So we'll say very quickly, medris is the tumah that results any time that a zav places his weight on something. So, for example, on a sandal, when he wears the sandal, he's placing his weight on his sandal. Therefore, halacha lemaisa becomes tamei tumas medris. So listen to what the Gemara says over here. So halacha lemaisa, if the first strap comes off, but the second, and then you fix it, the sandal's status remains unchanged. Why? Because the sandal, even without the first strap, as long as it has a second strap, is still totally usable. Fine. Now what happens? The second strap falls off, and then you go ahead and you fix the sandal. Well, once the second strap falls off, then what? Then halacha lemaisa, the sandal loses its tumas medris, but it has a lower form of tumah as something that has come in contact with something that has tumas medris. Va'amrit Allah, ma'ishna rishona. And Rabbi, we asked about this. Why is it that when the first strap falls off the sandal still retains its total identity? Daha kaima shnia. Because Rabbi say you still have the second strap there, and as long as the second strap is there, the sandal is totally usable. But 1 second. Shnia nami ha kaima rishona. But remember, in this case, when the second strap falls off, they will say, what's the status of the first strap? What's the status? It was repaired. It was already there. So I don't understand. You're telling me when the first strap falls off, the sandal still retains its identity. The sandal still retains its tumah. Why? Because the second strap was there, and a sandal with one strap is absolutely usable. But 1 second. Then, when the second strap falls off, you tell me the sandal loses its tumah identity because without the second strap, it's no longer usable. But 1 second. Remember, when the second strap fell off, I will say, what was there? What was there? The new and improved first strap. So why doesn't that make the sandal usable, thereby preventing it from losing its tumah status? Here we go. Va'amrat lan Allah, panim chadoshos ba'u lekan. I will say, when that first strap is replaced, that is a brand new strap, part of almost like a different sandal. That new strap has no shaykhus to the second strap. That new strap, right, is part of the new sandal. The second strap is part of the old sandal. And when assessing the tumah of the sandal, ultimately vis-a-vis the second strap, we only look at old straps, not new straps. So we'll say, which really is fascinating. So essentially what the halacha says is like this. When the first strap falls off, and you go ahead and you replace that first strap, we don't view that first strap as a replacement of the old first strap. Instead, we view that as a brand new, like a brand new sandal. A brand new sandal has been created. So we'll say, therefore, when the second strap falls off, in halacha, how do we see that sandal? When the second strap falls off, how do you see that sandal? How do you see it? As a strapless sandal. Incredible. As a strapless sandal. And because it's a strapless sandal, therefore, it loses its tumas medris. But it's not a strapless sandal. You have the new and improved first strap, which fell off and was then replaced. Panim chadoshos ba'u lekan. That's not part of the old sandal. That's part of the new and improved sandal, which has no shaykhus to the old second strap. So the Gemara says, Hachanami panim chadoshos ba'u lekan. We'll say, now let's back this up. So now, so too by the kli. So we'll say, remember again, what was the question by the kli? I have a utensil which is tameh. I want the kli to use its tumah status. How does it lose its tumah status? How? By piercing it the size of a pomegranate. So we'll say, so what happens? So what happens if I make a little kizayis whole fillet? So how do we view that in halacha, Rabosai? We view that every single time you pierce the kli, that's a hole. The fact that you fill it in, that's panim chadoshos ba'u lekan. That's part of a brand new kli. But we're focused on the old kli. And the old kli has a series of smaller holes, which we are then able to combine to make one larger hole of a rimon of a pomegranate. Therefore, I will say that case will allow the kli to lose its tumah, because again, essentially, when the kli is filled in, we look at that as a brand new utensil. When assessing the holes, we look at the holes that were made in the old utensil. So we'll say, now let's back this up once more. Therefore, what does that mean for our karfeif? Remember again, how do we get into this mess, right, to begin with? So remember again, we had a karfeif that was more than 2 beis sa'ah, that was enclosed for non-residential purposes. Now I have a residence that opens up to it. Wonderful. So now I want to convert the enclosure into a residential enclosure. How do I do that? You have to make a breach of more than 10 amas and then fill it back in. What was the Gemara's kasha? Could I do 1 amma breach, fill it in, 1 amma breach, fill it in, 1 amma breach? And the answer is yes. Yes, but 1 second. You never had 10 amas of breach? Yes, I did. Because in halacha rabosai, when you breach something and then you fill it back in, that new fill-in, right? That new entity, that's panim chadashos ba'olakan. That's a new utensil. That's a new wall. That's a new sandal strap. And that ultimately, again, is not reckoned as part of the identity of the older wall, older kli, older sandal. So also listen to this. They said to him, Kari alei. So also he said to him, he said this was Rabbi Yochanan. This was, yeah, he said about him, Kari alei, less din bar imish. So he said about him, this is not a normal person. Right? So remember again, this was Rabbi Yochanan. So he was saying about Rabbi Yochanan, this man is not a regular person. Rashi says, Ela malach. He was extolling Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan's knowledge was like angelic, not normal. Others say, Ikuda Amriki Gondin Barnash. Others said, no, what he said is, this is a man, right? Adam Gadol. So either way, he was extolling Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan again came up with this answer. So this, either he said, this is not a mere mortal, this is a malach, or like this is the true definition of an. So I'll say, I found it intriguing that like such praise would be heaped. I mean, it's a great answer, don't get me wrong. Panim Chadoshos Ba'alakan is incredible, but like, why is that angelic? So I'll say, sometimes the ability to see something new in something old is the greatest accomplishment. Right? It's the ability to see Panim Chadoshos Ba'alakan from something that's been around for such a long time is the mark of human accomplishment. Because Rabbi say, isn't this the key to successful living? How many times do we look at ourselves, same old person, making the same old mistakes over how many years? I'm not going to get out of it. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to evolve. And yet the ability to see something new. How many times have I made a breach, repaired it, made a breach, repaired it, but I'm still the same old guy. So the ability to go ahead and see something new, see a hischadshus in something old, is mamish the pinnacle of human accomplishment. The ability to see, and I will say there's an incredible musar in this, because forget about your wall, and forget about your kli, and forget about your sandal. The most important thing that you have to see, panim chadoshos ba'olakan, is in yourself. Right? They will say, when you look at yourself, when you wake up in the morning, you look at yourself in the mirror. So what do you see? Do you see a person who's just the sum of all of his past mistakes? Just whatever, I am what I am, I am what I am. Or do you say, you know what, new day, new opportunity, panim chadoshos ba'olakan. Today is a new day. I'm a new person. What about the breaches? What about the fill? It doesn't make a difference. Today is a new kli. Today is a new adam. Today is a new opportunity. The ability to live a life and the ability to see even in the most broken of things, panim chadoshos ba'olakan, less din barnash. That's not human. To be able to do that is almost angelic, is almost the pinnacle of accomplishment. Incredible yisod. Amar of Kana, Ruach Bosh Achorei Abat. We'll say another great case. It's a really fascinating cases. So we'll say a rachba is a large open area. A large open area that is behind a home. So we'll say, so again, it sounds like a backyard, but it's not a backyard. It's just a large, expansive area behind a home. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, so such an area like this is obviously, it's not really a Rishus Harabim, but Lamai says treat it like a Rishus Harabim. It's a large, really non-residential area. So therefore, again, you could only carry Dalit Amis inside of it. Rashi says, Rach Bashachori Abatim. Rashi says about 5 lines up from the bottom. Vein Pesach Habayis Pasuach Lo. there's no home that enters into this area. So we'll say, so again, so this is an area behind the house. The home does not open into this area. Let's assume for a moment that it's enclosed, but it's more than 2 base saw. Therefore, you could only go ahead and carry in Dalet Amis of this area. Okay? Bam Rav Nachman, in Pasach lo Pasach, mutal talta bekulo. So Rav Nachman says, however, if you went ahead and you opened up an entranceway from the home into this rachba, into this, we'll call it backyard area, so you could carry throughout its entirety. We'll say, what's the logic? Because now we can look at it as an area which is enclosed for residential purposes. Remember, having a residence that opens up into an enclosed area allows the area to be reckoned as an enclosed residential area. So the Gemara says, Pasach lo Pesach, bekulo. Pesach matiro. So we'll say ultimately again, because the entranceway, right, the entranceway has the ability to be matter the area. V'lo amran ela shepasach ulubasof hukav. Then I will say now again, there's a very important qualification. Chronology here is very important. That's only assuming that what? That first you made an entranceway into the rachba, to the backyard area, and then you enclosed it. Because I will say then the enclosure is viewed as what? Then the enclosure is viewed as being for residential purposes. Aval hokol lubasov pasach. But I will say, if you went ahead and you first enclosed it and only then opened the house into the rachba, then what's the halacha? I'm sorry. Aval hokol lubasov pasach lo. But ultimately, again, but halacha l'maisa will say, if you first enclosed it and then opened up the residence into it, it won't work. We'll say that's what we just learned before. Halacha l'maisa, an enclosure for residential purposes only works when the residential aspect is there first. If you enclose the large open area and there was no residential aspect, that enclosure, that wall, cannot work as a valid mechitza. So we just saw before, you could breach it and rebuild it, to which the Gemara says, Pasach, Lubasof, Hokav, Pshita. But so obviously, if you have the rachba, and you first open up your home into it, and then you enclose it, of course that works. That's an obvious case. Why does the Rice even have to say that? We'll say, what's the case? The case where there's a granary in that rachba. You might have thought that the reason ultimately you're creating the opening is not really, meaning you're opening the home into the rachba, is not really for the use of the rachba, but rather it's for access to the granary. And perhaps therefore that should not convert the rachba into a residential area. Kamashon, that's not the case. Kamashon, we don't worry about that. Good. We'll say, Vaiter. Karfeif, Yoser Mibei Sasayim, Shehokaf Ladira. So we'll say, here we go. I have a karfeif that's larger than 2 base saw that was enclosed for residential purposes. So far, so good, right? Actually, an easy case. Karfeif more than 2 base saw, enclosed for residential purposes. We'll say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? You can carry throughout the entire area, totally enclosed. Now here comes the problem. Now it becomes filled with water. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? So we'll say, the rabbis wanted to say, that a karfeif, even though again it is enclosed for residential purposes, which allows carrying throughout it, but now once it becomes flooded with water, it's the equivalent as if it was planted with vegetation. And also, as we just saw before, what's the halacha of a karfeif that is planted with vegetation? What happens? It loses its domicile identity. So therefore, a karfeif that's flooded with water is like one that's planted with vegetation, loses its domicile identity. Vasir, so the Gemara says, Amr Lahu Rav Abba, or Rav Abba Avu Dirav, Braid Rav Mesharshia, Hachaminu Mishmei Dirava. These are the same name of Rava. Mayim Kinetoim Damu Vishari. So what's the same name of Rava? That a karfeif that is flooded with water is one that is like one that is planted with trees. So we'll say, what's the halacha of a karfeif planted with trees? Halacha l'maisa, it retains its domicile identity. Why? Because people use the area in between trees. Not only that, but again, as we saw before, even if the trees are not planted in an orderly fashion, nevertheless, halacha l'maisa, the karfeif retains its domicile identity. So therefore, again, Rav, in the name of Rava, they're saying that halacha l'maisa, a karfeif filled with water is like a karfeif filled with trees, therefore it does not lose its domicile identity. Vishari, and it's permitted. Amud Beis, I will say, Amud Beis. Amra Meimar, so Meimar said, but 1 second, V'hu, the chazyon litashmishta. That's only assuming that what? That halacha l'maisa, the water is usable. We'll say, what does it look at? Rash chazol tashmishta, l'shtia, de'im l'chadira me'ula mizu. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Samimra wants to say, when does water not negate domicile identity? And when is water like trees? When the water is drinkable. Which makes sense, because if the water is drinkable, then what? Then Lamaisa, the karfeif is really usable. It's really usable. To which the Gemara says, but alocha Lamaisa, if the water is not drinkable, then einachinami, the presence of water will negate the domicile identity of the karfeif. Amr Rashi, udechazin l'tash mishnah nami lo amran eloshem ba'omko yosef beisasayim. So I'll say further, Rashi gives another qualification. Even if the water is drinkable, water will not negate domicile identity as long as what? She'ein ba'omko yosef beisasayim. What does that mean? Look at Rashi. She'ein ba'omko yosef beisasayim. Kilomar she'ein omko shalmayim nifshat berochav yoser al beisasayim. Va'omko shal stamayim levatam makomo midin karka. Yud tfachim. Okay, that means so it comes along Rashi, and Rashi says that's only assuming that the water is not 10 tfachim deep throughout the entire 2 base sa'ah. Aval yesh ba'omko yosher beisasayim aser. But say if the water is more than 10 tfachim deep on more than 2 base sa'ah of the area, then ultimately that negates domicile identity. So both say, so it's interesting. So Rav Ashi's logic is, while it is true, if the water is drinkable, so the karfeif, remember again, there's a karfeif more than 2 base sa'ah, which was enclosed for residential purposes. So far, so good, except now it becomes flooded. So the shaila is, what does the flooding do to domicile identity? So Ameimar said, it's fine, as meaning it's like trees, it doesn't negate domicile identity, as long as the water is drinkable. Rav Ashi wants to say, yeah, but it also can't be deep. If the water is deep, then essentially, again, it renders really the karfeif unusable. If it's unusable, then it loses its domicile identity. What's the definition of deep? More than 10 tfachim of depth over an area larger than 2 base saw. So the Gemara says, "V'lav milsihi." The Gemara says, no, the truth is, but we reject Rav Ashi's qualification. Midi dahava akarya deperi. So we'll say, because interestingly enough, he says this is no different than a pile of fruit. What does it mean no different than a pile of fruit? Look at Rashi. Karya deperi. Kari shalperos. Kavo asara v'rochav kirochav beis kar. We'll say if you have a pile of fruit that is 10 tfachim high, and let's say again as wide as a base core, lo batla toras dira misham. So we'll say, see, interestingly enough, what the Gemara wants to suggest is, if you have a karfeif, and the karfeif has fruit piled in it, right, and the fruit pile goes more than 10 tfachim high, and Lamais expands over 2 base saw, everyone's going to agree that it's not going to negate the domicile identity. Why? Because it's usable, and that which the karfeif is filled with is usable as well. So since the water is usable, even if it has a depth of 10 tfachim over 2 base saw, that will not negate the domicile identity. So both say, halacha l'maisa, what comes out of this case, and this is really quite interesting, and halacha l'maisa, that if you have a karfeif which is more than 2 base saw and it closed for domicile purposes, halacha l'maisa, even if it becomes flooded, that does not negate domicile identity. As long as the water is drinkable, even if it's deep, halacha l'maisa, it retains its identity. Next case, domicile identity. Hayrachba, Davei It's an interesting case. So there was, you have to, you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit for this. So remember again, there was the rachba. So remember again, rachba is that area behind the house, right? That area behind the house, that we'll call it that backyard area. So we'll say, so those of you who have, you have the picture there? Okay, so good. So you'll see if you are using the picture, it's I'm assuming we'll have the same. I'm assuming it's the same number. Josh, what number is it? Picture 142? Is it the same number? Yeah. So if you're using that book that Josh has, or hopefully the Gemara has the same, or Moshe can send it out on the WhatsApp also. So again, you can see the picture of your Rabbi Seif, how this is. So it's a very simple case. You really, even if you have absolutely no imagination, I'm going to get you through this. So don't worry. I mean, that's sad if you have no, but again, it will different discussion. Hey, Rachba, so let's listen to this. So there was a backyard area, a backyard area that was in Pum Nara. Dechad Gisa Hava Pasich Lemasa. One side of the Rachba was open to a Mabay. So this is just, if you can imagine over here, the way this works as follows. This is a little bit different then in the case of the rachba beforehand, right, in the previous case of we'll call it the backyard area, it was a backyard area that came off of a house. In this case over here, if you could imagine the following. So I'm going to work you back from the Rosh Hashanah. So in front, you have the Rosh Hashanah, okay? The Rosh Hashanah, all through Rosh Hashanah, perpendicular to the Rosh Hashanah is a mavui, right? To the sides of the mavui are homes with chatzeros. If you imagine, so now you're walking into the mavui taking you on a little bit of a virtual tour. You're coming in from the Rosh Hashanah, you're walking into the mavui. If you keep walking into the mavui, you walk into the rachba. Then you walk into the large open area. Keep walking through the large open area, you get to another path. That path to your right and to your left are vineyards. Keep walking through that path, and that path dead ends at a river. At a river. So that's the whole topography or geography over here. So the Gemara says as follows: Hahu rachba davet bepum nara. Suppose I say now again, there was a large open area that ultimately again came up to a mavui. That's what it means. So I'm sorry. Davet bepum nara. So pum nara is the name of the place. The chad gisa have a pasech lamasa. On one side of the rachba, it opened up to the city. Now both say city over here means mavui. It opened up into the mavui that went into the city. The chad gisa have a pasech l'shvil. And on one side of it, it opened up into a pathway shel kramim that ran in between vineyards. Ushvil shel kramim havasalik leguda dinara, and the pathway between the vineyards ultimately ended up at the banks of the river. Okay, so Abaye says, I think the whole picture book is online. Is that correct? Okay, so you could. I think Moshe already sent out the link to it. If not, we'll send that today. So we'll say it's good to keep it up because the truth is the pictures are very helpful in general. So the Gemara says, Amra Abaye, Hechi Navid. So we'll say, so the shaila is, what should we do in order to allow for carrying inside of the rachba? So Hechi Navid. So what should we do? Le'avid le mechitza aguda dinara. So we'll say, if you say that we should go ahead and make a mechitza, make a wall on top of the river banks. Now, now here's the interesting part over here. So the idea is, remember, the river, we had this before, this is already in Shabbos' daf. So the idea of the river itself often serves as a natural mechitza. How so? Because remember again, anything that goes down 10 tefachim, remember, we often think of a mechitza as a partition that goes up. But a partition that goes down is also a mechitza. So if you say, well, okay, so I will say, so now if I want to enclose the rachba, so maybe what I just do is let me put an additional mechitza at the end of the path by the river. So I'll put an enclosure by the end of the path by the river, and that mechitza essentially will work for the rachba. So the Gemara says that won't work. Why? Ein osin mechitza gabe mechitza. So we'll say, we'll see where this concept comes from. But halacha lemaisa, you can't make one partition on top of another partition. Since halacha lemaisa, the bank of the river is already a mechitza, you can't put another mechitza on top of that mechitza. Again, where that concept comes from, we'll see. So the Gemara says, so no problem. Why don't you just make a tzura sapesach? We'll say, right, a doorway, which is just two side posts and a top post. Go ahead and make that at the entranceway of the path to the vineyard. So we'll say, so if you can imagine, essentially, make a tzura sapesach on the back end of the rachba. Tzura sapesach on the back end of the rachba, and that will allow you to go ahead and carry in the rachba. So asugam le shadjan le, because we'll say, what's the problem? The problem is, remember, what would often happen over here is that camels from the Rosh Hashanah, if you could imagine, would come in through the mavoi, then through the rachba, then down the shvil between the paths, ultimately between the vineyards, and go to the river to drink. Camels are tall. The problem is if you make a tzuras HaPesach at the back end of the rachba, leading up to the shvil shel kramim, when the camel comes, it's going to knock it down. To which the Gemara says, so Abai says, fine, you know what, don't make it Tzuras HaPesach, just put a lechi there. Just put a lechi, just put a thin side post by the entranceway to the Shvil Shel Kramim, and that should allow you to carry in the Rachba. Since that lechi will work for the shvil shel kramim, right? Will work for the pathway. It'll work for the rachba as well. Look at Rashi just a moment. Migo de mahani l'shvil l'taltal bo to lo havi hashta parts of So we'll say. So remember again, that lechi allows you to carry in the shvil. Because remember again, the problem is without the lechi, so the shvil itself is considered to be open to a carmelis. The carmelis is the rachba. So just like the lechi allows you to carry inside of the shvil, the lechi should also allow you to carry in the rachba. Amar le Rava said, here's the problem. Yomru lechi moil l'shvil shal kramim da'alma. The problem with that is people will say that in general, a lechi will work for a shvil shal kramim, and that's actually problematic, right? So I'll say ultimately again, because if you have a shvil shal kramim, see in this case, the lechi will work for the shvil shal kramim. Why? Because on the other end, the shvil ends, it dead ends by the river. So because it's dead ends by the river, it's considered to be closed on one end. But people might think that a lechi will work for a shvil shel kramim that's open on two ends, mufulash, and of course that doesn't work. Ela Amar Rava, rather what should you do, says Rava, here's the Eitzah, Avdina lepes lechi lepischa de masa, de migo de mahani le lechi lemasa, mahani nami lerachba. So we'll say simple Eitzah. What's the Eitzah? Place the lechi at the exit of the mavui. See, Rabbi, remember again, let's go back for just a moment. The mavui in question, technically speaking, is what they call a mavui b'fulash. It's an open mavui. Because remember again, on one hand, right, the entrance of the mavui is where? Where? Rosh Hashanah. The other end of the mavui opens into this rachba, which is technically a carmelis. So Rabbi say that mavui, so let's assume for a moment that you're going to make a tzuras HaPasach at the entrance of the mavui that opens up into the Rosh Hashanah. That other side of the mavoi also needs something in order to allow you to carry in the mavoi. So what do? Place a lechi by the side of the mavoi that opens into the rachba. And once the lechi works for the mavoi, the lechi will also work for the rachba. So halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara suggests that in this case over here, the way to go ahead and remedy the rachba is essentially put a lechi we'll call it by the exit of the mavui, and that lechi that works to the exit, remember the exit of the mavui is also the entrance for the rachba. So the lechi that works to the mavui will also work for the rachba, and therefore allow you to go ahead and carry in the rachba as well. All right, so we'll stop over here. We're going to pick up Emirat Hashem with this case tomorrow. Shkoyach.